Hi, this presentation is going to briefly introduce the concept of socialization from a sociological perspective. And the process of socialization is one in which we learn the beliefs, values, norms, and behaviors that are appropriate for a given culture. And that's one to which we belong, we're born into it, and we are trained to be a member of a culture and a carrier of that culture. So in some ways, it's a way of transmitting culture by putting it inside of us. It becomes our second nature. Now, we mentioned in another presentation on culture the debate of nature versus nurture, and so when we look at socialization, this becomes a central question in some respects. How much of who we are is determined by our biological makeup, our genes, and so forth, and how much is determined by our cultural upbringing? And there are different ways that these questions have been addressed empirically. For instance, there have been studies of isolated children that allow us to see what humans become in the absence of any socialization. Extremely neglected kids like Jeannie, for instance, exhibit a lot of animalistic qualities, even though eventually some do learn to communicate and learn some of the other rules of living within a particular culture. It's often very difficult. Feral children, those who have lived out in the wild, are other examples of that. And we can also learn from deprived animals, not to mention twin studies. And twin studies offer a unique way to study this because what you've got are, in the case of identical twins, two humans with identical genetic makeup who may express themselves very differently in terms of their behavior. So we have to attribute any differences to differences in nurture, since the nature is a constant between the twins. And this gets particularly interesting when we look at twins who are raised separately, in different families, for instance. And Guo offered one such study a little while back, 2005, and concluded in some regards that this whole nature versus nurture concept is indeed a false dichotomy, and we continue to learn more about genetics and how they function. But essentially, what Guo finds supports other research on genetics, and that is to show that our behavior is a combination of both. Now, some things, like if we look at this table, heritability has to do with what we inherit, and this part has to do with what we are taught. So for the twins who are raised in the same environment, we have the shared environment, and those who are raised apart, we have the unshared environment. And what we find is weight, for instance, how much we weigh, has a lot to do with heritability. It's a 0.74 correlation between the twins' weights, regardless of whether or not they're in the same house or not, which means it's not just what's being cooked for dinner, but what our genes predispose us for in terms of weight. Now, certainly, being raised in the same household is going to have a very different effect than being raised in different households, but to have two people raised in completely different households still so closely related in terms of weight as it points to genes. But when we look at other things like smoking, we do see that there is a genetic predisposition for smoking, but the majority of the variation in smoking behavior is explained by nurture. Although some people certainly have a predisposition to addiction to cigarettes, for instance. Hyperactivity tends to be more genetic, so it has very little to do. We shouldn't say it has nothing. It has very little to do with how you're raised. Personality has a lot to do with nurture, but there is a big nature component to that. And I can tell you, watching my kids grow up from being infants, you could see a lot of their personalities taking form right from the beginning. So there's something very interesting about that to me. So we're complicating this idea of nature versus nurture. Now, when we look at socialization in general, we find that there are some special forms of it, like we are, for instance, socialized into our genders to express ourselves in particular ways, to hold different values of masculinity and femininity, for instance. So then an important question becomes, where do these ideas come from? And a lot of that is reinforced through mass media, the types of advertisements we see, the television shows, the movies we watch, the video games we play, the toys we play with when we're kids, and so on. These all have a lot to do with how we think of men and women and so on. There's also this thing called resocialization, which is the idea that we can kind of remake who we are within our lives. Now, sometimes that's a minor process, such as when we get a new boss at our job, and there's a new sheriff in town, so to speak, new rules to play by. Well, we have to learn those new rules, and so that would be a minor form of resocialization. A more intense form would be joining a group like Alcoholics Anonymous, where people are really striving to reinvent themselves so that, for instance, they no longer feel the need to drink alcohol in that case. But there are more extreme forms, such as when people enter total institutions like prisons or boot camp for military or police training, for instance. A lot of times the process involves completely breaking the individual down. Their old self goes away, a new self is built. And when they leave boot camp, a lot of times they say you're a new person, and that's true in a lot of regards. You've been totally remade. New socialization has taken place. There's also this thing called anticipatory socialization, where we try to imagine what our future is going to be like when we occupy different roles. So let's say we're a college student and we want to know what it's like to be a police officer. We're maybe a criminal justice major, and we do ride-alongs with the police, for instance. We might try to anticipate what it's like, performing this role, working in this job. A lot of times when people take an internship, it's because they want to engage in this process of anticipatory socialization. Now, we have different theories of socialization that help us explain how we become who we are, how we develop a self-concept, and how our social psychology develops in general. And so we're going to look at a few different theories about how that happens. And the first of the theories we're going to review is Mead's role-taking theory. And this theory has three distinct stages. Looking at the development of small children, essentially, Mead argues that initially, very small children under the age of 3 start to develop simply by imitating others. Monkey see, monkey do, sort of just rote copying of behavior. And so there's no internalization at this stage, according to Mead. It's not until we get to the second stage, the play stage, which he puts at 3 to 6, where children start to pretend that they are others. In other words, they start taking the role of specific others. Now, these could be real people like mom or dad, or they could be imagined others like a princess or Spider-Man. By the time kids get to the age 6 or 7, they start to become capable of team play, such as playing sports and understanding how multiple roles fit together. And that's an important step in the development of children and of the self. So Mead breaks down these others into 2 categories and says that the ability to develop over time is a process where we take the role of significant others, especially during the play stage. And actually, when we're in the play stage, which is the second stage of development, Mead says we don't yet have the ability to understand the generalized other. As we become more developed, we enter the game stage, the third stage here. We then do develop the ability to think of the generalized other. So a small child might say, I won't do that because mom says it's bad. An older child will say, I shouldn't do that or I'll get in trouble. And implied in that is the school or somebody will come after them, a generalized other. So who is responsible in terms of socializing young children, helping us develop into adults? And of course, socialization is a lifelong process, but a lot of fundamental socialization happens at a young age. So of course, when we're young, of course, the family is important, our neighborhood to which we belong, our daycare center maybe if we belong to a daycare. For some people, it's religious institutions, people involved there. Of course, the school and peer groups play an active role when kids are young, as do sports, teams, and other types of competitive activities. And then as we get older, increasingly the workplace starts to become an important source of socialization. So for me, the idea of developing the self is a social process where we begin by interacting with others. And we're just in that first stage of imitation. There's only an I. We only we only see the world outward. We don't see ourselves as an object. As we develop the ability to take the role of others, we start to see ourselves as an object, as a role that we're playing, first of specific others and then generalized others. And then over time, we become more sophisticated in our thinking, and our self develops out of the dialogue between the I and me. And in fact, it's the dialogue between the two that Mead calls thinking and thought. A similar theory comes from Charles Horton Cooley's Looking Glass Self, and essentially this is more about the how process, how we come to develop and modify our self-concept in response to the reaction of others. So first, we imagine how we present ourselves to others, which is sort of an inside job. At that point, we haven't actually seen a reaction. We then imagine how others evaluate us. So, we might observe reactions other people have and try to anticipate what they're thinking. Now, we could be wrong about that, but the important thing is our evaluation, not what they're actually thinking, because the evaluation is what's going to lead us to step 3. We develop a feeling about ourselves. So if we feel like we're getting a nod of approval or a look of disapproval, that's going to shape our feelings and in turn our behavior. And that is how, over time, we begin to develop a self-concept, according to Cooley, through the looking glass self. The mirror of who we are is actually the reaction of other people. And like Mead, Cooley points out that the others with whom we interact don't have to be real people. They can also be imagined others, heroes, gods, mythological characters. The impact, however, on us is quite real, even if the other is not, and so that's an important point. And there we might reflect on W.I. Thomas's dictum or theorem, the idea that that which we define as real will be real in its consequences. And so whatever we imagine the reactions of others to be is going to have real consequences for how we evaluate ourselves and then in turn shape our behavior. A third theory comes from Goffman, and this one is unique because it doesn't involve any sort of subjective self or even the notion of a self-concept. It's purely about appearances and outward expressions of who we are. So Goffman's theory is called dramaturgy because it's based on the idea that people behave in ways that are similar to actors on a stage. That is, we have a role, we present our role to the audience, we engage with the audience, and we adjust ourselves based on the reaction of the audience. But the important thing here, according to Goffman, is how we manage our impressions to the audience. So this involves an individual slanting the presentation of self to create a distinctive appearance and satisfy the wants and desires of an audience. Now, of course, that can get pretty complicated if we have mixed audiences. In Goffman, if you read his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, gets into a lot of those nuances. Very enjoyable book to read. I recommend that. So Goffman is less concerned, as we said, with the self-concept. He would argue that who we are depends on who our audience is, and that, of course, is going to change from situation to situation, which means we might be one person in one situation and another person in another situation. For instance, when somebody goes to their job, maybe they're a police officer, they perform that role in a particular way, but then when they come home and they perform the role of dad or mom, they're going to be a different self. So then the question Goffman might ask is there even a core to who we are? Is there any kind of self that carries over from place to place? Or are we simply chameleons? We just simply become who we are based on the situations we're in. And of course, that's a very outward-based view of the self, but it is an interesting juxtaposition to the views of Cooley and Mead, who are more interested in what's going on internally as we develop a self-concept. And that's going to do it for our brief introduction to socialization theories. Thanks for watching.